It's Tuesday, the 12th of December. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel. And on Thursday, the 7th of December, a YouTuber named Tennessee Girl and her father were killed in the crash of her 1965 Beechcraft Debonair on Thursday, the 7th of December. And a lot of folks are speculating online as to what happened in this accident without doing much research. Here's what we know so far. First, from the Aviation Safety Network, Thursday, 7 December, Beech C-33 Debonair 1965, November 5891 Juliet, 2 fatalities, 2 occupants on board near Cornersville, Tennessee. A Beech Debonair crashed for unknown reasons near Cornersville, Tennessee. The aircraft was being flown to Bryant, Saline County Airport, Arkansas for an instrument panel makeover. The pilot and her father were identified as the crash victims. And here's the picture of the aircraft, November 5891 Juliet. The flight was intended to go from their hometown airport here at Knoxville Downtown Island, 432 miles all the way over here to Little Rock, Saline County Regional Airport, where they were going to get some avionics work done on the aircraft. But the flight ended up crashing right here just south of Cornersville, Tennessee, near the Leave Airport at about the 1,000-foot elevation at 11 o'clock local time in the morning, and the weather was perfectly clear. Eyewitness reports a very high-speed accident site, with eyewitnesses reporting the aircraft coming in at a nearly 50-degree steep angle with the power on the aircraft, and the aircraft was not stalled or spinning. Nor does the crash site look like a stall-spin accident, nor does the data. Here's the preliminary ADS-B data for 5891 Juliet. The data represents about an hour and 15 minutes worth of time from takeoff to the crash. They start out departing the hometown airport there, climbing initially to about 22,000 feet or so. I assumed perhaps to stay below the Class C airspace for Knoxville, and then resume the climb on up to an ADS-B altitude of 6,300 feet, probably 6,500 feet indicated altitude, with a ground speed around 150 miles an hour or so. And then right about in here, we begin to start to see fluctuations in altitude and airspeed. Aircraft climbs up to about 6,500 ADS-B altitude and then descends down to about 6,000 feet, so about a 500-foot climb and descent. Airspeed fluctuates 169 as they climb back up, down to 138 miles an hour. Get it stabilized again briefly. We start another descent down to 6,000 feet. Another climb up to 6,400 feet. Ground speed fluctuating. Now a larger descent, and these oscillations continue to get kind of worse and worse as the flight progresses. 6,200 feet. Up to 180 miles an hour, down to 5,300 feet, and then a climb on up, back up, overshooting the desired altitude of 6,500 feet to nearly 7,000 feet, down to a ground speed of 124. Another descent down to 5,200 feet, up to 188 miles an hour, and a climb on up to 6,300 feet. So back and forth this goes until we get to the very end here. A big slow climb from 4,400 feet back up to about 5,600 feet, and look at that ground speed drops off to about 109, at one point about 99 miles per hour, and then the big final drop from about 5,900 feet into the mountainous terrain with ground speeds in excess of 216 miles per hour. If we look at the granulated data from FlightAware here, we see the initial rate of climb, a good 900, almost 1,000 feet per minute. That's a high-performance airplane, the Debonair with the IO-470 Continental engine, and settles down to about 500 feet per minute. And then some minor fluctuations in vertical speed. And then we begin these climbs and descents, keeping it within about 500 feet per minute, climbing and descending until we get towards the end Now we're starting to see descent rates upwards of 962 feet per minute, then a climb back up 650 feet per minute, and then the final descent, the last 3 data points, 1,800 feet per minute, 3,900 feet per minute, and 6,000 feet per minute. Ground speed, 216 miles per hour. All the time the course is staying very steady within a couple of degrees of course, which is what makes me think that the autopilot was on leading up to this loss of control of the aircraft. This is TNFlygirl's YouTube page, the victim in this accident, Jenny Blaylock, and her dad. And Jenny left a very clear record of her training to date in this aircraft here on YouTube and on Instagram. She had just crossed the 400-hour total time mark, and she'd purchased this Debonair aircraft about a year ago, a high-performance single, and she had either owned or had access to a Cherokee aircraft before this Bonanza. And a lot of the content that's on here regarding her training, a lot of it involves her dealing or attempting to deal with the autopilot in this Debonair. The autopilot that Jenny is learning to use is the Century 2000 Autopilot. The aircraft that Jenny was flying did not have electric trim. That electric trim would have been located right here on the left side of the left yoke. Instead, there is the standard autopilot disconnect button located right up here. This Century Autopilot had a trim prompt system, which required you to manually keep the aircraft in trim at all times. Below her notes here is the manual elevator trim wheel located right here, just the same as it is on all the Bonanza and Debonair style aircraft. So running the aircraft with the Century 21 Autopilot with a trim prompting system and not having electrical trim, no electrical trim on the aircraft, that means the chances of a runaway trim are virtually nil because there is no electric trim to run away. The only way you can get this aircraft severely out of trim is for the pilot to manually trim the aircraft in a out of trim condition, especially if that pilot is fighting with the autopilot, and especially if that pilot does not understand the different functions of this Century 2000 Autopilot that are critical. Here's the operating manual for the Century 2000 Autopilot, and the panel has a mode control panel located right here and an annunciator panel located right here. And one of the first things you got to learn about autopilots is what you bid and what you get. You tell the autopilot what you want it to do by pushing the correct button here, but you must every time verify that that mode is engaged using the annunciator panel over here. Now let's go over the functions of each of the buttons here on the autopilot. Turning the autopilot on with this button here, the default mode is heading and attitude. Attitude, it's going to pick up whatever attitude on the artificial horizon. It's not going to pick it up into an automatic altitude hold function. It's going to be an attitude, ATT. Test function right here, heading, corresponds with this heading annunciator light here. It's going to pick up whatever heading you put in the heading bug up here. Nav, it's going to switch from heading to nav and fly whatever course is on your course indicator window here. And you should have the corresponding nav annunciation here. Approach allows you to fly in approach mode. For example, an ILS, you'll pick up the CDI here and the glide slope right here, and it'll fly that ILS right down the line for you. Reverse for a back course localizer approach. Alt, here's the altitude hold button. Now you push this altitude hold button and a pressure transducer, a simple bellows, will hold the current pressure altitude of the aircraft. It doesn't necessarily read the altimeter, it just is reading this pressure transducer. And any time that pressure transducer senses a change in pressure, it's going to send a voltage to the pitch trim servo and adjust your altitude to maintain a constant pressure. And you should see this third light down here, enunciated altitude. To get the autopilot in altitude hold mode. Now, if you want to climb or descend, you got to push either up or down. When you press either the up or down button, the autopilot reverts back to attitude, not altitude. It reverts to attitude, and you can command a up attitude or a down attitude. Now, the Beechcraft does not have electric trim, nor does it have auto throttles, obviously. So if you want to climb, you've got to add power. If you want to descend and not increase airspeed, you've got to decrease power. Basic pitch and power. Then once you get to your desired altitude, you can hit the Alt button again and it'll level off and maintain that altitude. And these two trim lights here, trim down is located up here, trim up is located down here, just like the trim wheel, trim up, trim down. These lights flash when the autopilot senses that the aircraft is out of trim, and you need to, if in the case of this Debonair, you need to manually trim the aircraft to extinguish these lights, because there is no electric trim function on this aircraft to do this function for you. You have to manually keep the aircraft in trim using the manual elevator pitch trim. And the key to these up and down switches that puts the autopilot back in attitude mode is these are momentary switches. These are not switches that you press and hold until you get to your desired altitude. You just press it and get your desired attitude on your attitude indicator, and then if you're going to climb, you're going to have to add a little power, and then you're going to have to trim the aircraft. So here's the notes from the manual. Altitude mode, ALT, will cause the aircraft to maintain pressure altitude present at the time of altitude engagement, that pressure transducer. And then you can engage the altitude while the aircraft's climbing or descending. But you should do it smoothly. I prefer to get the aircraft leveled off, trimmed up, and then hit the altitude button. Pitch modifier switches. This is what puts the autopilot from altitude mode to attitude mode. The pitch modifier switches are momentary push button type switches located on the right side of the programmer, used to modify the airplane's attitude and to shift the autopilot from altitude mode or altitude hold mode to attitude mode. And a lot of this is what I'm afraid is what Jenny didn't clearly understand about this autopilot. Now, each autopilot has a pre-flight test sequence that you need to do prior to the first flight of each day to ensure that the autopilot is working correctly and that you can easily override the clutches in the autopilot. It only takes about 10 or so pounds of force to override the clutches if you need to, if you try to override the autopilot without turning off the autopilot disconnect switch. But if you mistrim the aircraft and get this aircraft way out of trim and a real high airspeed, those forces can be overwhelming to a pilot of moderate physical strength. So it's not the autopilot that takes over the aircraft, it's the mistrimming of the aircraft itself. And if you fight the autopilot to a point where you so badly mistrim the aircraft, you can get yourself in big trouble. And for those of you that are studying for your instrument check ride, if you're going to use the autopilot during your instrument check ride, you better know everything about that autopilot, and you better demonstrate this pre-flight procedure to your examiner on your check ride. Like I said, Jenny posted almost all of her training videos up to this point here, and warts and all, reviewing your video during training is a great way to learn the lesson, but then going out and posting it all on YouTube, you don't know what you don't know, and this clearly shows what she doesn't know. But at this point, she realizes she's getting some bad instruction, and she has to fire her instructor. This young man is just helping her entirely too much through the entire process of learning how to fly IFR. I mean, it's one thing if you're going to work together as a crew, CRM, but as a single pilot IFR, you got to be able to do all this stuff on your own. And here's Jenny's explanation of this.
Just fly this 260 here, so back to the left a little bit. Okay.
The young man is pushing the buttons, doing the radios, doing nearly everything for her.
4148 Echo, Knoxville altimeter 2909 go home. 2909 just stop. Stop. Just stop doing it. You're going to drive me crazy.
Just stop. These are
I know
all
what you guys
Jenny's
are thinking,
ads
and I'm going to go
into
ahead
a
and
video.
say it. This is kind of painful for me to watch as well. I'm not the PIC that I should be in this stage of my training. I am going to take the blame for allowing it to get this far. I have read some of the comments of my previous lessons
Telephone.
in regards to why I am not on the radio talking to the tower as much as I should be. And you're right. And I take the blame for not being more assertive during my training, being in more control of the radios and navigation. I'm frustrated for being more like a puppet than a pilot, and obviously it continues in this final lesson. But it is what it is at this point, and moving forward, I have a new instructor. I may or may not be posting as many of my instrument lessons as in the past. We shall see. But because of some of my weaknesses I have carried over from my previous training, I've had to take a few steps back to some basics.
So I had an opportunity to review one of these subsequent videos where, yes, the new instructor took her back to very basics, pitch and power, the vertical S maneuver, and Jenny was having a terrible time just maintaining aircraft control with basic pitch and power exercises. A lot of distractions going on in this cockpit here with 2 or 3 cameras videoing the whole thing and all the new equipment that she's trying to figure out. Then after she let go that flight instructor, Jenny goes and continues to fly with her dad, and her dad is not a rated pilot, and they continue to try to figure out this autopilot system on their own. And this video is only 4 weeks old. All of this has happened within the last month or so. And this is what leads me to believe that she doesn't have a clear understanding of how the autopilot works.
Helicopter 4 Echo Golf. We're now 2 miles south of the field, just maneuvering out here for a second at 2,000.
Boy, she ain't climbing good at all.
You do not press and hold the up button. It's a momentary button switch. But Jenny, why is it not climbing? Because, let me see if I can zoom in on this. There's no power to the engine. There's very little power here. You need to add the power to the engine. There's no auto throttles. You have to climb the aircraft up and trim it. So it's a momentary up button switch, then power and trim to climb to your altitude. But she's got that power way back down here to about 15 inches of manifold pressure.
Alright, so right now what I'm going to do, while this is autopilot, and I'm
It's not the autopilot. It's the
yeah, I'm a
operator.
little ways off here.
I've been
So
holding that button to climb.
just watch my airspeed if you don't mind.
But what about your air? I can't see.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be at 43.
43.
If you don't add power and you demand the aircraft to climb, what's going to happen to your airspeed?
And I'm going to try to get this.
Still a very low power setting. Still climbing about
Trim
400
makes a
feet per minute. That autopilot's working fine.
Yeah, I'll watch my.
Show and trim up.
Flashing trim up light.
We're getting too close to stall speed. Stop it.
Stop it. There.
See?
Yep.
She finally does the right thing and disconnects the autopilot, but clearly doesn't understand why all that happened. And that was just 4 weeks ago. Now, to be fair, Jenny did have a problem with this autopilot initially. It would not go into altitude hold mode, but she did get that fixed, and the autopilot was working correctly. But she was struggling so much with this autopilot that she made another correct decision to not use the autopilot in her check ride. But had she gotten proper instruction on the use of this autopilot, this would have been much less of a problem. So despite all her troubles through training, Jenny continued to post all of her videos, and it shows where she was just in over her head. She was very far behind the aircraft. You can see it in these videos here, and she never had a really clear understanding of how that autopilot was supposed to work, and then she went and tried to figure it out herself, and it looks like on the day of the accident, the pitch mode of this autopilot and her mismanagement of the manual trim is what investigators are going to be looking at as the possible cause of this accident. There's very little left of the aircraft. One of the most important things investigators, if they can find it, is in what condition was the elevator trim. Because if you added an excessive amount of manual down elevator trim and allow the airspeed of the aircraft to pick up faster and faster and faster, that elevator trim is going to get so heavy that even a person with moderate strength may not be able to pull that aircraft out. You have to reduce the power, slow the aircraft down, and get the aircraft in trim. If you confuse that for the pitch mode of the autopilot can easily be overridden with just 10 pounds of force, but it can be very confusing to a new pilot in a complex aircraft. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.